All right, welcome back. This morning we will have our last talk. This talk is is based on the voice of the silence. This talk, testing. This talk is based on the voice of the silence. Probably most of you are familiar with this little and very deep book. It's composed of three fragments, as HPB calls them. And she says that it's part of what she learned by heart in Tibet. She learned several of them. And she says that she translated them into English, so we don't know in what language she learned them. We can speculate on that. But there are three fragments which are independent from each other, but they are also connected in some way. The first fragment, which is called The Voice of the Silence, and the whole book takes the name after it. It's a fragment that talks about meditation quite a bit. And since we are talking about the logos and the word and the unmanifested logos, the voice of the silence can be seen as that part, that aspect, that unmanifested word. So in this talk we are going to, I selected some excerpts from the first fragment. Every quote you see there will be from the first fragment, and highlighting the process of meditation that the voice of the silence talks about. And this process of meditation is, as we saw yesterday, is a process of reversing our manifested awareness back to the source. So the voice of the silence opens with these words, which are like a summary of what is to come. These instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of the lower id. It is a word for psychic powers. He who would hear the voice of nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of dharana. Dharana is a state of concentration, and in the voice of the silence is a quite deep concentration. You can take dharana in all different kinds of levels. The voice of the silence takes the last steps that you can also find in Raja Yoga, in Patanjali's Raja Yoga, but the steps are taken in a quite deep sense. So if you want to hear the voice of the silence and understand it, then first you have to be able to attain dharana, let's say. And then she says, or the voice of the silence says, having become indifferent to objects of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja, which means the king of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakens illusion. So first we have to become indifferent to the objects of perception, and there is a lot about that too in the voice of the silence. And we need to seek out the king of the senses. You know, in Hinduism and in Buddhism, there is the idea that the mind is a sixth sense, not with the meaning of telepathy or something like that. Sixth sense because we have the five senses that come through our normal, what we call senses, and then the mind is one that organizes all the impressions. So you could think, or you could interpret that this king of the senses is the mind, and then the voice of the silence says we have to seek out the thought producer. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. And the voice of the silence says this thought producer is the one that awakens illusion. And then it says the mind is a great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. The first interpretation about this is the lower mind. This mind refers to the lower mind. But probably at a certain point, even what we would call the higher mind is also an illusion. It is said that at a certain point, even the individuality is transcended, the individuality that is based on the higher manas is transcended, and then the unity is recognized. So, of course, all this is symbolic language. If you just slay the mind, then you become mindless. But it means to transcend. Then the second page talks about the first issue in this process, which is related to illusion and reality. Because we perceive the illusion, we don't perceive the reality. So the first step is to begin to see the illusion as illusion, so that we can begin to perceive the reality. And the voice of the silence says, when to himself, to the aspirant, his form appears unreal, as do on waking all the forms he sees in dreams. So we have to begin to perceive ourselves as the formless consciousness. We normally, obviously, identify with our form, with my body, with my appearance, with my psychological makeup. But part of the mystic process is to begin to feel ourselves as being this formless breath of consciousness, which takes this body in particular for this incarnation to express itself, but it's not myself. This is just a vehicle of consciousness, as we normally say. But the main point here is we have to begin to perceive ourselves as formless consciousness. Then it says, when he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound which kills the outer. And again, we are in life constantly distracted by many things and by many little aims and little goals and desires and this and that. And then because our whole attention is so much in the many, we cannot perceive the one, the source, the one source from which we come. And so we have to stop hearing the many. Again, it doesn't mean we have to go to the forest and retire from the stimulation. It means that we may be working in the world, but without being drawn or without being exhausted in the many. You know, when Krishna says, with a fragment of myself, I manifest the many, but I'm not exhausted in the many, I remain myself. That may also be taken in this way. The spiritual person can manifest in the world, but is not exhausted in this manifestation. There is always this staying in the center of consciousness. And I think that that's part of what this verse says. So, when our form appears as unreal, when we are not distracted by the many, then only, not till then, shall he forsake the region of Asat, which is the opposite to Sat, meaning the false, to come unto the realm of Sat, the true. So this is the first point. We have to stop being so identified with illusion, personal and in the world, and only then we can start perceiving the real. So I think this is my notes. The 2 points that the voice of the silence talk about is first transcending the personal, and we will see that the voice of the silence talks about purification, purifying the personal and detaching from the personal. And then the other counterpart of this is discerning the real, and that has to do with introspection and silence, with stopping paying attention to the many, to come inside, to look inside to the source and of our true being. So we will see this through the talk. So then there are some foundations that have to be set to be able to listen to the voice of the silence. It says, before the soul can see, the harmony within must be attained, and the fleshy eyes be rendered blind to all illusion. So you can interpret that to see is to be able to understand life, to see what is going on. We go through life like blindfolded. We don't know what is going on, why things happen, what we should do here. We don't have this understanding. We can interpret this word to see as to understand. But before we can understand from a spiritual point of view, we have to attain a certain inner harmony. We know how the inner contradiction produces psychologically a chaos, where we are feeling and thinking and doing contradictory things, and there is not a clear path. So this harmony within can be seen as aligning the thoughts and the emotions of the personal self with the spiritual will. If we can align ourselves at the personal level with the spiritual force that is trying to push us in a particular direction, then we attain harmony. All the pieces of our personality or our whole being are going in the same direction. And only then we can start seeing, we can start understanding. So there is a need of purification of our lower nature. Anything that is not in tune with the higher view, with the higher self, has to gradually be purified, let go of. We have to look at it, understand it, and let go of it. Then the voice says, before the soul can hear, the image, we as a personality, has to become deaf to roarings as to whispers, to cries of bellowing elephants, as to the silvery buzzing of the golden firefly. So basically, before we can hear, to hear would be a kind of deeper understanding. To hear would be getting in touch with the inner voice. You know, usually seeing is used as a symbol for a more concrete aspect of reality, getting in touch with a more objective aspect of reality. And to hear is a symbol for getting in touch with a more subjective aspect of reality. So before the soul can hear, before not only we can comprehend the world outside and life, but we can also hear to our inner voice, we have to become deaf to all these desires and all these little goals that the world wants to impose on us. So we have to learn to produce a state of quietness in our minds and emotions. This culture makes particularly difficult for people to attain a state of silence. I can imagine, of course I didn't live at that time, or if I did I don't remember, but I can imagine that the farmers probably had a far easier time to be quiet. We have so much stimulation that it's really difficult to stay quiet. And so in order to be able to hear the inner voice, we have to generate this state of detachment that leads to equanimity, that makes us be with more poise as we go through life. So these are foundations in which we can start working. Of course, if we get to this in a perfect way, we are probably an adept. But we have to go into this direction, start walking there. And then it says, before the soul can comprehend and may remember, she must unto the silent speaker be united. So this is a third step in which comprehend and remember, I take it as the continuity of consciousness. Remember brings the idea of there is something there already, but it was forgotten. So the spiritual consciousness is already there on the spiritual plane, but then when we incarnate on this physical plane, we forget it. So before we can really remember our true nature, retain an awareness of our true nature, even on the physical plane, we need to unite our consciousness to the silent speaker. And this is part of the process of introspection and meditation that we were talking about yesterday. So we have to learn to withdraw our consciousness towards the higher. So let us see what method the voice of the silent proposes. Of course, the method is not very well defined, so I just try to get the sense, the spirit that seems to be behind the voice and present it in a more systematic way. So there is this verse that says, that which is uncreate abides in thee, disciple. If thou wouldest reach it, and blend the two, thou must divest thyself of thy dark garments of illusion. So the first is the uncreate principle is in us. If we want to reach it and blend the two, blend the personal self with the eternal self, with the uncreate principle. If we want to reach the uncreate principle and produce this union, we must let go of the garments of illusion. Again, we see here the rejection of the illusion. And then it says, stifle the voice of flesh, all the desires and the personal things. Allow no image of the senses to get between its light and thine, that thus the twain may blend in one. So there are two things that we need. First, to purify the desires, to detach from the desires, that's stifle the voice of flesh. And then to get into this state of mind where, as it says here, no image of the senses can get between the voice of the silence and the personal consciousness. And as we are going to see, the voice of the silence is a lot about transcending thoughts. And we are going to talk about that because it has several interesting aspects. But we could summarize this by saying we need to transcend the personal, and that can be only done through purification, detachment, and attainment of equanimity. And then we need to learn to control our thoughts. So that's purification and meditation. So then saith the great law, in order to become the knower of all self, thou hast first of self to be the knower. To reach the knower, the knowledge of that self, thou hast to give up self to non-self, being to non-being. Give up thy life if thou wouldst live. So we see that there are three selves that are talked about there. The all self, all in capitals, the self in capitals, and then the self in lowercase. So these are the three levels. The all self is Atman, the self is a higher ego, and the lower self is a personal ego. So in order to be able to perceive Atman, first we have to perceive the higher self, the higher ego, what we call in theosophy the higher ego. So that is our first step. We are in the personal ego. We have to become aware of the higher ego, of our pure individuality. And then we can perceive the Atman. But in order to become aware of the higher ego, we have to give up our identity with the lower self, with the personal self. Again, all this not in the sense give up the identity and become a vegetable. It's transcending the identity. There is something that sometimes people don't recognize, that when we transcend a particular dimension, transcending doesn't mean to escape from it. When we transcend something, we embrace the lower. So when we transcend the lower ego, we are not merely denying the lower ego. We are breaking our identification with the lower ego, and the lower ego stays there as a vehicle of consciousness, not as a master, but as the servant. So we need to give up the personal identity, and that doesn't mean we are not going to be able to work in the world. On the contrary, we will be able to work in the world far better, because we will be a vehicle of the higher and not of the personal desires. So more about transcending the personal. Before the path is entered, thou must destroy thy lunar body. The lunar body is the kamic principle, the lower passions. Cleanse thy mind body and make clean thy heart. You see, if you see the language in the voice is quite radical and harsh, you know, slay, destroy, kill. And I think that's very interesting in the sense that if you take it literally, and sometimes Blavatsky is reported to have said that we tend to be abominably literal. And if you take it literally, it's difficult to understand what it says. But I think this gives the sense of, okay, just let it go. You know, try not to make concessions. Then we all do, but little by little, if we know that the aim is just to let it go, eventually it happens. So then she says, the self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet. One of the twain must disappear. There is no place for both. And it is, you know, you are either identified with the personal self or you are not. You cannot be a little bit pregnant. You are pregnant or you are not. So you are either identified with the lower self or you are not. Of course, during life, we have moments in which we are identified with the lower self, and hopefully we have moments where we are not. But eventually, we have to get to this place where, you know, the higher self is basically working through the lower. And again, this is at the end of a certain stage of the path that this is attained fully. But we have to put all that as our ideal, because that's showing us in what direction we have to move. So then it says, ere thy soul's mind can understand, the bud of personality must be crushed out, the worm of sense destroyed past resurrection. See again the strong language. So this is part of how we can go through our daily life. It says, and again, take it allegorically. So it says, desire nothing, chafe not at karma, nor at nature's changeless laws, but struggle only with the personal, the transitory, the evanescent and perishable. So desire nothing. The idea is we have to try to start going through life without being so picky about it, without having so many requirements, so many expectations. It's more like getting into the flow of life. And life will present us with things, and we have to discern what we have to do. But fighting too much against life becomes a self-centered activity. Of course, sometimes we have to make changes, but even in trying to make changes, we can go just bullying our way through, you know, or we can try to flow in the direction that we think we have to go. So desire nothing doesn't mean necessarily don't have any desires. We always have desires, and part of the work is to transmute our desires and desire the spiritual. Eventually, probably we can transcend any kind of desire and become something else. But desire nothing is go with life. Don't be stubborn. Don't try to shape life as you would like it. And don't, you know, take what karma brings and make the best out of it. There are, whether we like it or not, karma presents certain situations. We can go through that situations dragging our feet as a little kid, but we have to go through it. Or we can go through it with a more intelligent attitude, seeing, okay, what can I get, even from a selfish point of view, if you take it, what can I get from this? Spiritually speaking, you know, if I have to go through this hard time, I don't want to go through it and be just a waste. I want to go through it and get something out of it, spiritually speaking. So I will try to develop patience or strength or, you know, peace or whatever it is, so that the situation wasn't wasted. Of course, it's difficult. We don't like difficult situations. We would like things to be smooth. But once they are there, I think this is an intelligent attitude, and we have to try to follow it. Many times our desires won't let us take it in that way, but the very effort to look at life from that point of view develops the skill. So the voice says, there is but one road to the path, and at its very end alone the voice of the silence can be heard. That is also people, and many times we expect immediate results. But there are certain things that can be only seen when the storm is over, as another book, Light on the Path, would say. The spiritual life is many times going blindfolded through the storm without seeing any result for our efforts, without seeing you know, any acknowledgement that we are on the right track. And then when that process is over, then the result is seen. Then the voice of the silence is heard, if we are talking about the big cycle. But not before. So when we are working on ourselves, we don't have to be disheartened, disappointed that it seems that we don't see any change. Most of the work we do has to do with the inner planes, and the results on the physical plane are the last ones in the chain of causation. So all our efforts are reorganizing, awakening, attuning our inner principles, which are the ones that are real or more real. So at the end of the process, we will meet the fruit of the effort. And then the ladder by which the candidate ascends is formed of ranks of suffering and pain. These can be silenced only by the voice of virtue. Again, in the New Age, the idea is to promise people joy and be spiritual, and you'll be joyful and peaceful and everybody will love you, and it's not how it works. So probably you all know that. In the process of growing, there is always a certain amount of suffering. And the more we cling to that has to die, the more we suffer, just because we are clinging to something that is not real. So it is inevitable. I read once, I think it was from HPV, but the anecdote is that HPV was on a train with a group of European theosophists, and I think they were in India. I don't remember the details, but the gist of it is that Blavatsky was talking about the path as being really hard, as she usually did, and then she would say to the Europeans, which include all the modern Western world, said, you know, you are too sissy, too weak to be able to go through the path, because you are too hung up on comfort and this and that, and the path is so difficult. And then the master scolded HPV and said, you know, you are scaring people away, so you know, slow down. But I see something interesting in this, because when you have this picture before your eyes, when you actually do encounter the difficulties, you are not surprised. Nobody told you, hey, come to the spiritual path, you will be joyful and happy. Yes, that will be at the very end, or there are moments, you know, there are cycles. When the cycle finishes, then there is this sense of being really alive, and you say, what was I doing before? You see that stage of life as being, you know, kind of lifeless. So at the end of each cycle of work, there is this sense of being alive, and then comes another cycle of work, and with time we begin to develop the ability to face difficulties in a more impersonal way. So there is a strength by which we can go through difficulties. And I don't know if it is a masochist feeling that sometimes grows, but when everything goes fine, you are a little suspicious and you say, what is going on? Am I asleep? Of course, when you are in the storm, you say, please give me a break. But the idea is that developing virtues, developing, you know, purifying ourselves and developing strength and patience, this all helps a lot in the process of growing out of the personal self. So now comes this all has to do with purification, detachment, equanimity. Now comes the other aspect, the aspect of being the masters of our minds. So the voice says, strive with thy thoughts unclean before they overpower thee. For if thou sparest them, and they take root and grow, know well, these thoughts will overpower and kill thee. If you watch how the thoughts work, you can see this very clearly. You know, sometimes we are fighting against some negative thoughts or emotions, and you find yourself once and again drawn into this particular state of mind and emotions. If you want to work on that, and if you want not to fall into this state, you have to catch the thoughts when they just appear in your consciousness. Once they grow, it's very difficult. You are in the middle of the battle. You have to really strive and, you know, fight, figuratively speaking. It's really difficult once the mood is developed to deal with it. But there is the beginning of the thoughts. When the thought is really weak, the problem is that we are not aware of them. We become aware of these states when it is big enough to be evident to our eyes. But we have to begin to watch our mind, to be alert to our mind, because it's very easy. Once you get the hand of it, it is very easy. The thought appears, you detect it, and it's easy to drop it. You say, no, not here, you know, get out of the temple, and you drop it. And when it is at the beginning, it's quite easy to do. It's like anything else. It's a skill. You have to try it, and eventually you develop the skill. But if you let it grow, then it possesses you, and it takes over your nature for a while. And that's what the voice of the silence is saying there. And then it says, beware, disciple, suffer not, even though it be their shadow, not even the echo of those thoughts, to approach. For it will grow, increase in size and power, and then this thing of darkness will absorb thy being, before thou hast well realized the black foul monster's presence. Which is exactly a very beautiful and poetic way of saying what I just said. You know, we are just taken over by the mood or the feelings and thoughts. So now the other aspect, this is the aspect of learning to control thoughts in our daily life. And again, controlling the thoughts is not repression. Repression is an unconscious mechanism in which certain thoughts appear in our consciousness, and there is a mechanism, automatic, that represses it, that doesn't let our awareness to realize these kind of thoughts. That is a process of repression. But seeing a thought, seeing that thought is not wholesome, and deciding to leave it, to drop it, to reject it, that is not repression. We are doing that with awareness. So that is trying to control the thoughts is perfectly fine. Eventually, as we said in some other talks, there is this control of thoughts is kind of automatic. We generate a certain strength at the level of our mental principle, in which thoughts come, they are illumined by awareness, and if they are not wholesome, they just drop by themselves. So the state of awareness itself takes care of them. But at an early stage, we need to do it by our willpower, with intentionally. So then it says, silence thy thoughts, and fix thy whole attention on thy master, whom yet thou dost not see, but whom thou feelest. So this is in meditation. As we practice in daily life to control our thoughts, to be able to drop them, then in meditation we can do the same. We can focus our thoughts, our attention in one particular thought, and we are going to see that, and we can drop the rest. You will see that thoughts come, there is like a field of consciousness. You are focusing on a particular object of meditation, and other thoughts may come, and then when they enter the field of consciousness, they just leave. So there are thoughts like around the field of consciousness, but it's like they don't really enter and steal your object of meditation. So it says, merge into one sense thy senses, if thou wouldest be secure against the foe. So again, the idea of the diversity, all the senses merged into the one sense. It is by this sense alone, which lies concealed within the hollow of thy brain, that the steep path which leadeth to thy master may be disclosed before thy soul's dim eyes. So she talks about this sense that is in the hollow of the brain, and it's talking about the pineal gland when we talk on the physical level, which, as we are going to see, is the seat of the spiritual consciousness in the brain. But we are going to see that later. Long and weary is thy way, the way before thee, O disciple. One single thought about the past that thou hast left behind will drag thee down, and thou wilt have to start the climb anew. Killing thyself all memory of past experiences, look not behind, or thou art lost. Again, this poetic and radical language. In the process of meditation, we have to get more and more absorbed in the object of meditation. So each thought takes us back from this absorption, and then we have to start again. Of course, it's not starting from zero. You will see that you are concentrated, and then you get distracted, and then you come back to the concentration, and in a shorter time you can get to the same depth of concentration. But every distraction is taking you away from this. We will see what technique of meditation the voice is probably talking about. It is not clear because Blavatsky skipped some of the instructions, as she usually does, but we will see what technique of meditation she's probably talking about. So then we have the stages of yoga. As you may be aware, Blavatsky says that this is a kind of a teaching or treatise that comes from Arya Sangha. Arya Sangha was the founder of the Yogacara school. It's not a Sangha. A Sangha is the person that scholarship thinks that founded the Yogacara school, who was a brother of Vasubandhu. These two Indian sages formed the Yogacara school. That's what scholarship thinks, or thought, not too long ago. Now they started discovering some sutras with the Yogacara teachings that predate Asanga, the historical Asanga. So they are now thinking that Asanga was not really the founder of the school. And they say that whenever the school started, it was several centuries before Asanga. And this is exactly what Blavatsky says in her writings. She says there was the Arya Sangha, the real Asanga, that was a disciple and generated this school. And little by little the school was formed. And then the one that organized everything took the name of Asanga, as they used to do. It's very common in India. It was very common to take the name of your master, or the lineage, that you were part of. And so she says the real Arya Sangha is different from Asanga. But the point is that the voice of the silence seems to be based on the Yogacara school. We don't know a lot about the Yogacara teachings. There is quite a bit of information, but most of the sutras are not really translated. The works of Asanga and Vasubandhu are volumes and volumes. They are very encyclopedic. But trying to relay the voice of the silence with what we know of the Yogacara teachings throws some light into the system. And that's what we are going to try to do. So Blavatsky, at the end of the voice of the silence, there is like a yoga described, not too different from the Yoga Sutras, as we are going to see. And there are different stages, and we are going to go through them. So the voice says, the rose must re-become the bud before it's born of its parent stem, before the parasite has eaten through its heart and drunk its life sap. So again, the idea of going back to the origin, the rose becoming the bud. What technically speaking is called, as you already know, unbimbalization. We have to dis-bimban ourselves from, so the reflection has to come back to the source. So it says, the pupil must regain the child state he has lost ere the first sound can fall upon his ear. So the idea of coming back from the reflection to the source of the reflection. And then the voice of the silence talks about 7 sounds that I'm not going to go through them. It's not easy to see what they mean, but there is this description. It says, thou hast to hear the voice of thy inner God in 7 manners. And this is like a summary of what the 7 sounds are said to be. The first one, the voice says, is like the nightingale, sweet voice, then a silver cymbal, then the melodious ocean imprisoned in its shell, the vina, which is a kind of Indian harp, or the bamboo flute, the trumpet blast, and the dull rumbling of a thunder cloud. So it may be that one way of interpreting this is that at the beginning the voice of the silence, or the voice of our higher ego, is heard in a very subtle way, and then little by little it becomes more and more evident, until at the end it says that it's like the thunder, and after this the voice says, the seventh, this thunder kind of sound, swallows all the other sounds, they die and then are heard no more. So it may be a process in which the voice of the silence becomes more and more imperative in your life until it overcomes any other little voice of the desires that are drawing you away from the voice of the silence. So that's one of the interpretations, but it may also refer to some mystic sounds that may be heard on the psychic plane, on the spiritual plane. So the initial stage in this yoga is described like this. The light from the one master, the one unfading golden light of spirit, shoots its effulgent beams on the disciple from the very first. So this reflection of the higher is from the very first upon us. Its rays thread through the thick dark clouds of matter. Here and there we are aware of this reflection when matter gets out of the way. And it says, but O disciple, unless the flesh is passive, head cool, and the soul as firm and pure as flaming diamond, the radiance will not reach the chamber, its sunlight will not warm the heart, nor will the mystic sounds of the Akashic heights reach the ear, however eager at the initial stage. So this higher consciousness here and there illumines our consciousness, the lower consciousness, but the voice talks about the higher consciousness reaching the heart. And it says, unless the flesh is passive and the head cool and the soul firm and pure, then the higher consciousness cannot reach the heart. And then it relates the heart with the Akashic sounds. Now in Hinduism, the heart chakra is called the Anahata chakra. And Anahata means a sound that is not being produced by beaten instruments. It's a sound that comes, like in the Zen koan, what's the sound of one hand clapping? You know, the Anahata is the unbeaten sound or something like that. And it is said that when the consciousness is or actually in regular Hinduism, when Kundalini touches the heart chakra, then the Akashic sounds are heard. When Blavatsky describes Kundalini in the Voice of the Silence, she describes a spiritual Kundalini, not a physical Kundalini. Every force in the theosophical view, every force has 7 layers, 7 manifestations. The Kundalini that most people know about is the lowest layer, the physical layer, that is woken up with physical exercises. You even pressing some points in the body or with the breathing or with similar things, you can wake up this Kundalini, which of course is not recommended in the theosophical literature. But the Kundalini that the Voice of the Silent talks about is, and Blavatsky says that in a footnote, is the awakening of Buddhi, is the Fohatic Kundalini that appears when our consciousness touches Buddhi, when Manas activates Buddhi, and Buddhi becomes the source of spiritual energy. So the heart is described by Blavatsky as the center of spiritual consciousness. In the collective writings we find that the heart is a center of the spiritual consciousness, but the spiritual consciousness cannot be guided by a person, nor can its energy be directed by him, unless he is completely united with Buddhi Manas. So the spiritual consciousness cannot guide the personality fully until we blend Manas with Buddhi, our mind with our spiritual intuition. Until then, the spiritual consciousness guides the aspirant if it can. That is, it makes efforts to reach him, to impress the lower consciousness, and those efforts are helped by his growth in purity. So the more we purify our nature, physical, emotional, mental, then the easier it is for the higher spiritual consciousness to affect the personal one. So she says, in the heart is the only manifested God. The other two are invisible. So the heart is like the seat of the third logos. And it is this manifested God that represents the triad, Atma, Buddhi, Manas. The effort, she says, should be continually made to center the consciousness in the heart and to listen to the promptings of the spiritual consciousness. So you can interpret this in two ways. The heart representing this higher consciousness, this manasic awareness that is in tune with Buddhi, this sense of silent awareness, but also it talks about the physical heart. In meditation, all traditions have a kind of meditation in the heart. In Christianity, for example, in the Orthodox Church, there is a very famous little book, The Diary of a Russian Pilgrim, in which he makes this meditation in the heart, repeating a prayer. And then in Hinduism, we have the meditation in the heart, visualizing the Purusha there. In Tibetan Buddhism, of course, there is all this deity yoga. So the heart is said to be also like a shortcut to the spiritual consciousness. And actually there is, okay, I'll show you a little later, there is some words from Master K.H. talking about the meditation in the heart. Now Blavatsky connects the heart, the spiritual consciousness, and the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a representative in the brain of what the heart is, and the heart and the pineal gland are the reflections of the higher consciousness, or the seed. So she says, the aura of the pineal gland vibrates during the activity of the consciousness in the brain and shows the play of 7 colors. The septenary disturbance and play of light around the pineal gland are reflected in the heart, or rather in the aura of the heart, which is negative to the brain in the ordinary man. Normally the spiritual consciousness in the heart is passive in regards to the spiritual intellectual consciousness. So she says the pineal gland is in truth the very seat of the highest and divinest consciousness in man, his omniscient, spiritual, and all-embracing mind. This seemingly useless appendage is the pendulum which, once the clockwork of the inner man is wound up, carries a spiritual vision of the ego, the higher ego, to the highest planes of perception, where the horizon opens before it and becomes almost infinite. Remember that the voice of the silence said a little bit in some quotes before, talked about the hollow in that brain, that the sound cannot touch it. So there is a connection between the pineal gland and the physical heart and the spiritual consciousness. I just want to point that out because it's an important occult correspondence. So, okay, there is a meditation in the heart that Master K.H. recommends. This is not in the Mahatma letters to, it seems that it was sent to A.P. Sinnett, but it was a more inner or esoteric, kind of letter, so it was not published. But I think the first one who published this was William Judge in The Path. They published a fragment of this, and there were other members in Europe that also had this fragment of a letter. And Blavatsky, in the instructions to the esoteric school, she reproduces this, and she says, the student will now begin to understand why so much stress is laid on the heart in connection with meditation. And so with regard to concentration, the Blessed Master Kutumi writes, and this is part of the letter that was published. It says, your best method is to concentrate on the Master as a living man within you. Make his image in your heart and a focus of concentration, so as to lose all sense of bodily existence in the one thought. The great difficulty to overcome is the registration of the knowledge of the higher self on this physical plane. To accomplish this, the brain must be made an entire blank to all but the higher consciousness. So to stop listening to the many, to listen to the one. And then Blavatsky says, when the brain is thus rendered a blank, an impression from the heart may reach it and be retained. Remember, she said, in the normal person, the brain consciousness is active and the heart, the spiritual consciousness, is receptive. In meditation, we can reverse the polarity so that the spiritual consciousness can impress the brain. And then what that means is that we retain the spiritual consciousness in our waking consciousness, in our daily life. So we have to begin to make the heart more active and the brain less active. Meaning we have to generate this state of awareness in which the brain is receptive, and then the promptings of the spiritual consciousness can be perceived. So the voice of the silence talks about, Kundalini as Buddhimanas, and the heart as being the seat in which Kundalini awakens the sounds, and that be connected to the hollow in the brain. So I think it's talking about a kind of meditation in the heart. Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, meditation in the heart with visualizations is very common. And remember that this is essentially a Tibetan Buddhist sutra belonging to the Yogacara school. So the first stage, as we saw a few slides ago, it was to try to generate a passive flesh or a passive body, a head that is calm, and that is a concentration that is firm. So then she talks about the second stage. She says, unless thou hearest, thou canst not see. Unless thou seest, thou canst not hear. To hear and see, this is the second stage. We are free to interpret that, and one possibility, as we said before, unless we hear the voice of the silence, we cannot see and understand ourselves, life, and understand the world. But at the same time, unless we begin to understand life from a more spiritual perspective, we cannot hear the voice of the silence. So there are these two aspects, the inner understanding and the outer understanding, that has to become very active in ourselves. And that's the second stage in yoga, in this yoga. So you see, the first stage and the second stage seems to deal with daily life, with our training in daily life, to become, to produce this state of equanimity, detachment, and this deeper understanding. Then she doesn't say anything about the third stage. She just puts these dots. So we don't know what the third stage is. And then she says, when the disciple sees and hears, and when he smells and tastes, eyes closed, ears shut, with mouth and nostrils stopped, when the four senses blend and ready are to pass into the fifth, that of the inner touch, then into the stage the fourth he hath passed on. So we come from this to hear and to see together to all the senses blending one, and to, it says, when we can hear without the eyes, hear without the ears, smell without the nostrils. So what is she referring to there? In Tibetan Buddhism, in this meditation in the heart, as well as in Hinduism, there is the idea that the visualization has to be so strong that the visualization at a certain point begins, or the person begins to be able to touch, begins to be able to hear, to see, as if it were a concrete image, the source of visualization. If you are in other parts of the letter, of this letter that Blavatsky quotes, the master says that once you generate this image of the master on the astral light, you actually generate a kind of entity. And the master says, if it is if you can hear the image speaking to you, it can be the master or it can be your higher self. All these things are not very much talked about in theosophy because they are kind of dangerous. This image that you form can be also ensouled by an elemental or even by evil entities. And there are stories, we were talking about Alexandra Devi Neal. She did this and she generated with visualization an entity that even people could see around, and she had a lot of trouble with it and had to learn how to dissolve it. Because if you don't do it with a pure motive, you may attract other kinds of forces. You are generating with Kriya Shakti a body that can be ensouled. That's how the human beings were created. The Manasaputras generated, and with the help of the Varishats, but generated by Kriya Shakti human beings that the souls incarnated, certain type of human beings. So we do the same. We can generate, if our visualization is strong enough, something that can be a vehicle for your higher self to talk to you, or for elementals or all kind of other things. It depends on your purity. So, yes.
Can you really to see with the eye closed, meaning you see, but you don't see what you, like images or forms. It's a different... Well,
in this particular technique, and I'm not saying that we should all do this technique, but it's what the voice of... I'm talking about this technique because it seems to be what the voice of the silence is talking about. But in this particular technique, you work to actually see the figure. You see the figure, and you keep going until the point of the figure becoming to you an objective reality. And there is also this story by Ali Murad Beg. He was a disciple of the masters for a while, but he had a past of black magic, so eventually he failed. He wrote a wonderful text, the Elixir of Life, but he did something, he applied this technique with an ill intention in the past, and then that catched up with him and he had a lot of troubles. Ali Murad Beg, Godolphin Mitford is his real name, or he changed several times name. And he created, he wanted to create some, well, I don't go into that. But he used this technique. It's a technique that is known in yoga, but as anything that has to do with the occult is dangerous because we don't have the right intention. So that's why this is taught in the third and fourth stage, after all the process of purification, of rejecting the unreal, or of control of thoughts. You know, this is not something that you can teach to people, hey, just do this, without any preparation. So the idea is that in the fourth stage, I think, you know, when the disciple sees and hears, and he smells and tastes, eyes closed, ears shut, with mouth and nostrils stopped, when the four senses blend and ready are to pass into the fifth, that of the inner touch, then into the stage the fourth, he has passed on. I think it may be referring to that just because of the tradition from which it comes from. But as anything else can be interpreted in different ways. Now, what is interesting, we already saw that, what is interesting is what comes later on in this fifth stage that also gives me the clue that this may be the method that she's talking about. Because she says, and in the fifth stage, O slayer of thy thoughts, all these again have to be killed beyond reanimation. So you had gotten to a point where thoughts were under your control. And now it says that now again you have to slay the thoughts. So it never makes quite sense to me why you are like going back. You know, you already did that in the process, and now it says that you have to kill your thoughts again. But in this technique of meditation, once you attain the visualization, you always end by dissolving the visualization. And you dissolve the visualization and you stay in the formless state of consciousness. The visualization is an anchor for your consciousness to be stable and to be focused on something that is the representation of the spiritual consciousness. And then you dissolve the form, because all forms are still part of the world of forms. So you dissolve the forms and you stay in this state of no image, no thoughts, which, you know, can be related in Patanjali Raja Yoga with the Asampranyata stage, where you let go of any mental process, and then you make the visualization disappear, and now here starts the higher stages of meditation. The fifth stage, Blavatsky relates it to Pratyahara. In Raja Yoga, Pratyahara is the ability to retreat the mind from any object of perception. So your visualization would be your object of perception. In the fifth one, you have to learn to even dissolve the visualization and retrieve your consciousness. And it says, withhold thy mind from all external objects, all external sights, and then withhold internal images, lest lest on thy soul light a dark shadow they should cast. So you reject the external and also the internal image that was so far the anchor for your meditation. And she says, Pratyahara is a preliminary training in order to control one's mind thoughts. In Tibetan Buddhism, all this visualization is a way to develop the ability to control thoughts, to be master of your thoughts. You can create these, visualizations, dissolve them, so that in daily life you have a perfect mastery of what enters in your awareness. That's part of the training. But this is all like preliminary training. Now comes the inner yoga that is beyond visualizations. So the sixth stage, having become indifferent to object of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakens illusion. Thou art now in dharana, the sixth stage. And Blavatsky has a footnote that says, in the sixth stage of development, every sense as an individual faculty has to be killed or paralyzed on this plane, passing into a merging with the seventh sense, the most spiritual. So in dharana is this dwelling on the silent mind. In this particular process, it is actually a mind without thoughts, but this is an occult kind of process. And then the seventh stage. When thou hast passed into the seventh, O happy one, thou shalt perceive no more the sacred three, for thou shalt have become that three thyself. So the higher you become the higher consciousness, and as we said, you don't perceive the higher consciousness as an object anymore. You are the subject. You are the higher consciousness. So you stop perceiving it as something different from you. Thyself and mind, like twins upon a line, the star which is thy goal burns overhead. And Blavatsky regards that as a star of initiation. The three that dwell in glory and in bliss ineffable, now in the world of Maya, have lost their names. They have become one star, the fire that burns but scorches not, that fire which is the upadhi of the flame. All is this very beautiful poetry. And this, O yogi of success, is what men call dhyana, the right precursor of samadhi. And she says in a footnote that dhyana is the last stage before the final one on this earth. So the idea is that the yogi, but at this point the yogi is still conscious of the self. He doesn't see the higher triad as an object because he is merged in the higher triad, but he's still in that point that we saw. There is still a sense of individuality. Samadhi is going into the white circle. You're going beyond even the spiritual individuality. And that's what Blavatsky says, one step more, and he will be on the plane beyond the seventh, beyond these sets of planes, or the fourth according to some schools. So dhyana is retreat. We were, the idea of the diversity, to stop listening to the many, then to blend the two in one, then we come to the one individuality, just as we saw yesterday. And in dhyana you are in this individuality, and in samadhi is going beyond and becoming the white circle. Okay, we can stop here. There are a couple of more slides, but we can talk about them after the break during the study course. Okay, then we.
I would suggest just continue. I think people would love you to continue, no?
Okay, yeah, I don't. It's not two more. Yeah, I didn't remember. Okay. So there is something if we relate these stages to the teachings of Yogacara, I think they give us a map to recognize in our consciousness where to go. In Yogacara tradition, if you look at the left, they describe 8 consciousnesses. There are 5 consciousnesses that are the ones from the senses, the consciousness of sounds, of smells, etc. Then they say there is a 6th consciousness, which is similar to the 6th sense in India, in the Hinduism, that is the thinking process, manas. Manas as thinking process. Then they say behind this there is a seventh consciousness, which is the sense of I-ness. Because we have this sense of this process of thinking, but there is a sense of there is an I behind. That's why we say I think. So the thoughts are like a function of this I-ness. And then they say that beyond that there is the alaya vijnana. The alaya vijnana is like the source of all the seven lower consciousness. It's like the karana sharira, or the causal body, because here is where all the karmic causes are kept. It's pretty much like the reincarnating ego in theosophy, only that in Buddhism they if I can be irreverent, it's just a joke, but they are allergic to the idea of something, an entity reincarnating. You know, the non-Atman, the Anatman idea is very strong in modern Buddhism. So they try to explain this, because if there is not a self, what's the continuity of the reincarnation? So they talk about the stream of consciousness, but then how do the karmic cause stay in this particular stream? Metaphysically, it's very difficult to explain rebirth without postulating some kind of continuity. So the Yogacara tradition developed this idea of alaya vijnana, which is very similar to the reincarnating ego. And in later Yogacara, in what we see today as Chinese Buddhism, they talk about the Tathagata Garbha, which is the Buddha nature, which is very similar to the idea of Atman in theosophy. Not Atman in Hinduism, except in Vedanta. In Vedanta, the Vedantic Atman is similar to Atman in theosophy. In theosophy, Atman is this one universal self. It's not that each one of us has a little Atman floating above our heads, like the Purusha in regular Hinduism. So this Tathagata Garbha is like this universal seed of enlightenment, this universal self. And in some of the Chinese Buddhism, they actually call it Atman, self. So if we relate the stages that Blavatsky was talking about, or actually Arya Sangha was talking about, with these principles of consciousness, it may be interesting. For example, pratyahara is to giving up any engagement with external or internal objects. So that means that is related to the process of thinking. Then dharana, remember that Blavatsky said, or the voice of the silence says, is to go and try to seek for the producer of thought. So the producer of thought is this sense of I-ness that is, you know, a little beyond the thinking process. So the dharana is a process of coming inside and looking for the producer of thoughts, which is part of what we did yesterday in the little exercise after the talk, to try to perceive what is behind thoughts. And now there is a process of thought. What is behind? Who is talking and who is behind watching? Then dhyana, as it was described, is uniting oneself with the spiritual individuality, with the triad, with the manifested logos, and that is related to alaya vijnana. And then Tathagata Garbha is this universal reality that is beyond even the individuality, the spiritual individuality, that has to do with samadhi. So if we relate this, we can have some goals for each one of the stages. So in pratyahara, which is related to the sixth consciousness, what we call kamamanas, the goal is transcending the thought processes. So by concentration, or by training ourselves in daily life to be master of our thoughts, then in meditation we can little by little go beyond the field of our thinking process. And that we do it by trying to focus ourselves on the thought producer. You know, Ramana Maharshi would say, work on the question, who am I? So there is a thought, and he would say, ask the question, to whom this thought appeared? And you would say, to me. And then he said, okay, ask, who am I? When I say me, who am I? What do I mean? And look inside. Don't give an answer, a metaphysical answer. Just ask the question and look inside. So we transcend the thought processes by trying to do this, by trying to put our attention at the origin of the thoughts. So once we begin to be there, we enter in the state of dhyana, which is related to, to dharana, which is related to ahamkara, to the sense of I-ness. as you dwell in this pure sense of being, which is the thought producer, then you can begin to perceive the spiritual consciousness that is behind. You can go and, okay, let us put it that way. You dwelling in the pure sense of I amness, you can begin to perceive the spiritual consciousness. That is what we call buddhimanas. Again, that can happen on the physical plane, or eventually in the future on the very Buddhic plane. But at the beginning, this happens on the physical plane. And then as you dwell in the spiritual individuality, you begin to transcend it, and you can actualize the Tathagata Garbha, which is how it is called in the Chinese philosophy. They say enlightenment is when you go beyond alaya vijnana, the spiritual individuality, and you actualize or become aware of the Tathagata Garbha. So this is like a little map to me that tells you what direction to go. And actually, it may be useful. And these are just models, you know, if they work for you. So we will finish with these last two slides where the last step or the attainment is described. And now thyself, the 8th stage, and now thyself is lost in self, thyself unto thyself, in capital letters, merged in that self from which thou first didst radiate. Where is thy individuality, Lanu? Where the Lanu himself? It is the spark lost in the fire, the drop within the ocean, the ever-present ray become the all and the eternal radiance. And now rest beneath the Bodhi tree, which is perfection of all knowledge, for know, thou art master of Samadhi, the state of faultless vision. Behold, thou hast become the light, thou hast become the sound, thou art thy master and thy God, thou art thyself, the object of thy search, the voice unbroken, that resounds throughout eternities, except from change, from sin exempt, the 7 sounds in one, the voice of the silence. Thank you.